Over German-occupied Europe in the spring of 1944, a P-51 Mustang falls from the sky trailing smoke and flame. The pilot pulls himself from the wreckage, alone in enemy territory, every instinct screaming survival. But First Lieutenant Bruce Carr does not hide. He does not surrender. Instead, he walks onto a Luftwaffe airfield in broad daylight and does the unthinkable. He steals a German fighter and flies it back across the lines. March 1944. The 9th Air Force is hammering German positions across France and the Low Countries. Every day, hundreds of American fighters and bombers lift off from British airfields, crossing the Channel into a sky thick with flak and enemy interceptors. The air war over Europe has become a brutal mathematics of attrition. Pilots go down. Some come home, most do not. The weather is filthy. Low clouds hang over the countryside like wet wool, pressing visibility down to nothing. Rain slicks the runways. Ground crews work in mud up to their ankles, patching bullet holes, reloading ammunition belts, and coaxing engines back to life. The smell of aviation fuel mixes with wet earth and cigarette smoke. Inside, operations tents. Maps are marked with red grease pencil, tracking losses that mount faster than replacements arrive. The P-51 Mustang has just begun to prove itself as the long-range escort fighter the bomber crews desperately need. Sleek, fast, and capable of reaching deep into the Reich, it is changing the calculus of daylight bombing. But in early 1944, most fighter groups are still flying older aircraft or transitioning to the new type. Tactics are evolving. Doctrine is being written in blood. First Lieutenant Bruce Carr flies with the 354th Fighter Group, the 9th Air Force unit that was among the first to receive the Mustang operationally in Europe. They call themselves the Pioneer Mustang Group. Based out of England, they fly ground attack and escort missions over occupied territory, tangling with German flak batteries and fighters that rise to meet them with desperate ferocity. Carr is 23 years old. He has the kind of face that belongs in a high school yearbook, not a combat zone. But his eyes carry the weight of too many missions, too many friends lost, too many near misses that leave you shaking long after you land. He is quiet, methodical, and utterly fearless in the way that only the very young or the very certain can be. On March 15, 1944, he takes off on what should be a routine fighter sweep. The mission is straightforward: strafe enemy airfields, disrupt Luftwaffe operations, destroy aircraft on the ground. The weather is marginal, but the order comes down anyway. The war does not wait for blue skies. Carr drops low over the German countryside, hunting for targets. The landscape blurs beneath him. Patchwork fields, narrow roads, clusters of farm buildings. Then he spots it, an airfield. Rows of enemy aircraft parked along the taxiways, fat and vulnerable. He rolls in. The Mustang's .650 caliber machine guns roar to life, raking the parked planes with streams of tracer fire. Explosions blossom orange and black. German ground crews scatter. Anti-aircraft fire arcs up toward him, bright and deadly. Then his engine takes a hit. Oil pressure drops. Coolant temperature spikes. Smoke begins pouring from the cowling, streaming back over the canopy in a greasy black trail. The engine coughs, sputters, and seizes. The propeller windmills uselessly. The cockpit fills with the acrid stench of burning oil and electrical fire. Carr has seconds to make a decision. He is too low to bail out. The Mustang is dying beneath him, losing altitude fast. He spots a field ahead, flat and open, and sets up for a dead-stick landing. No power, no second chances. The P-51 hits hard. The landing gear collapses. The aircraft skids across the dirt, tearing itself apart in a shower of metal and debris. When it finally stops, Carr is bruised, bleeding, and very much alive. He kicks open the canopy and climbs out into enemy territory. If this story matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Bruce Carr was born in Union Springs, New York, a small town where everyone knew everyone and the rhythm of life moved slowly. He grew up during the Depression, when work was scarce and futures uncertain. His family was not wealthy. They were practical people who valued hard work, resourcefulness, and keeping your word. As a boy, Carr was fascinated by machines. He took apart radios, rebuilt bicycle engines, and spent hours watching barnstormers perform at county fairs. The sight of a biplane looping through the sky ignited something in him, a hunger for speed, for freedom, for the kind of mastery that comes only from understanding a machine so completely that it becomes an extension of your own body. When war broke out in Europe, Carr was 18. He watched the newsreels, listened to the reports on the radio, and felt the pull of something larger than himself. In 1941, he enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces, betting his future on wings and altitude. Flight training was grueling. Ground school drilled cadets on navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems, and radio procedure. Flight hours were logged in trainers that were forgiving and slow, designed to weed out those who lacked the coordination or the nerve. Carr excelled. He had the reflexes, the spatial awareness, and the calm focus required to fly in combat. Instructors noted his ability to stay composed under pressure, a trait that would prove invaluable in the chaos of aerial combat. He earned his wings in 1942 and was assigned to fighters. The Army Air Forces needed aggressive young men who could think fast, shoot straight, and bring their aircraft home in one piece. Carr fit the profile. By the time he shipped out to England in late 1943, he had logged hundreds of hours in the cockpit and absorbed every lesson the training pipeline could offer. But nothing truly prepares you for combat. The first time you see a friend's aircraft explode in midair, the first time flak bursts so close you can hear the shrapnel rattle against your fuselage, the first time you squeeze the trigger and watch tracer rounds converge on another human being. Those are lessons that cannot be taught. Carr adapted. He learned to trust his instincts, to read the flow of a dogfight, to manage fear without letting it paralyze him. He became one of the squadron's most reliable pilots, the kind of man who could be counted on when things went bad. And now, standing in a muddy field somewhere in occupied Europe, his aircraft a smoldering wreck behind him, he faced the kind of problem no training manual addressed. He was alone, unarmed, deep inside enemy territory, and the nearest friendly lines were over 100 miles away. Most men would have gone to ground, hidden in a barn or a hedgerow, and hoped to link up with the French resistance. Carr did not. He had seen the airfield. He knew there were operational aircraft on that field, and he knew how to fly. He began walking. Escaping enemy territory after being shot down was a statistical nightmare. Pilots received survival training, issued escape kits containing maps printed on silk, a compass hidden in a button, and a few gold coins to bribe civilians. They memorized phrases in French and Dutch, rehearsed evasion protocols, and carried photographs of their uniforms in case they needed to prove their identity to resistance fighters. But the reality was grim. German patrols swept the countryside. Local informants, whether out of loyalty or fear, reported downed airmen to occupation authorities. The Gestapo and military police operated efficiently, rounding up Allied personnel with ruthless speed. Once captured, a pilot faced interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. For those who evaded capture, the journey back to Allied lines could take weeks or months, moving through networks of safe houses hidden in attics and cellars, passed from one partisan cell to another. The risks were enormous. One mistake, one wrong turn, One betrayed contact could mean death for both the pilot and everyone who helped him. Carr understood these realities. He also understood that time was his enemy. The longer he remained on foot, the greater the chance of capture. The Luftwaffe airfield he had strafed was still fresh in his mind. It was close, maybe a few miles, and it held the one thing that could change everything: flyable aircraft. The idea was insane. Walking onto an active enemy airfield, stealing a plane, and flying it out under the noses of German personnel was the kind of desperation move that ended in a bullet or a noose. But Carr was not interested in conventional escape routes. He was a fighter pilot. He belonged in the air. He approached the airfield on foot, moving carefully through the tree line that bordered the field. He watched the activity: ground crews moving between hangars, mechanics working on engines, aircraft taxiing out for operations. The field was operational, but not heavily guarded. The Germans did not expect an American pilot to walk in and take one of their fighters. Carr noticed a single-engine fighter parked near the edge of the field, away from the main cluster of aircraft. It appeared serviceable, no visible damage, no crew immediately around it. The type was unfamiliar to him in detail, but the basics of aviation were universal: throttle, stick, rudder pedals, instrument panel. If it had wings and an engine, he could fly it. He waited until dusk. The light faded. Shadows deepened. Activity on the field slowed as personnel rotated shifts. Carr moved. He walked out of the tree line, across the open ground, and straight toward the aircraft. He wore his leather flight jacket, his uniform trousers, his boots. In the dim light, from a distance, he might pass for a Luftwaffe pilot returning to his plane. It was a gamble measured in seconds and luck. No one stopped him. No one shouted. No alarm sounded. He reached the aircraft, climbed onto the wing, and slid into the cockpit. The interior was cramped and foreign. The instrument labels were in German. The layout was different, but the essentials were there: fuel gauge, oil pressure, altimeter, airspeed indicator, throttle quadrant on the left side, control stick between his knees, rudder pedals at his feet. Carr ran through the startup sequence, working from memory and intuition. Prime the engine, fuel mixture rich. Ignition switches on. He pressed the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered, and caught. The propeller began to spin. The aircraft shuddered to life beneath him. Now he was committed. The noise of the engine would draw attention. He had seconds, maybe less. He released the brakes, advanced the throttle, and the aircraft began to roll. Behind him, voices shouted. Figures ran toward him. He ignored them. The fighter picked up speed, bouncing over the uneven ground. The tail lifted. The controls came alive. He felt the airframe lighten as lift built under the wings. Then he was airborne. The stolen aircraft was a Focke-Wulf Fw 190, one of the Luftwaffe's most capable frontline fighters. It was fast, rugged, and armed with cannon and machine guns that could shred a bomber or tear apart an enemy fighter. German pilots respected it. Allied pilots feared it. Carr had no time to appreciate the machine. He was airborne over enemy territory in an aircraft he barely understood, wearing an American uniform with no radio codes, no navigation plan, and no idea if the fuel tanks were full or nearly empty. Every second in the air increased the risk of being shot down by his own side or intercepted by German fighters who would not hesitate to engage what appeared to be a rogue aircraft. He kept the aircraft low, skimming over the treetops, using the terrain to mask his profile. The Fw 190 handled differently than the P-51. Heavier on the controls, more responsive in roll. The engine note was rougher, the cockpit more cramped, but it flew, and that was enough. He oriented himself, by the position of the setting sun and the shape of the landscape below. He knew the general direction of Allied lines, west, toward France, toward the Channel. He pushed the throttle forward, and the Focke-Wulf surged ahead, eating up distance. Minutes passed, then more. The fuel gauge dropped steadily. He had no idea how much time he had before the tanks ran dry. He scanned the horizon for landmarks, for anything that might indicate friendly territory. Then he saw them. Aircraft in formation. American bombers returning from a mission, escorted by fighters. P-47 Thunderbolts. They were heading west, back toward England. Carr turned to follow, keeping his distance. He could not risk getting too close. From their perspective, he was flying a German fighter. They would shoot first and ask questions later. He shadowed the formation, staying low, trying to signal his intentions without provoking an attack. It was a delicate dance. Too aggressive and they would engage. Too distant, and he would lose them. He needed them to lead him home without killing him. The formation crossed into liberated airspace. Carr could see the patchwork of Allied-controlled territory below. Air bases, supply depots, military convoys. He was almost there. He spotted an airfield ahead. American markings, P-47s on the ground crews visible. He circled once, lowered the landing gear, and set up for approach. The Focke-Wulf settled onto the runway, tires chirping against the concrete. He rolled to a stop and cut the engine. The silence was immediate and absolute. Carr sat in the cockpit, hands still gripping the stick, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, American personnel stared in disbelief. An enemy fighter had just landed on their field, and climbing out of the cockpit was a U.S. Army Air Forces pilot, grinning like a man who had just walked out of his own funeral. The debriefing took hours. Intelligence officers wanted every detail: how he evaded capture, how he accessed the airfield, how he started the aircraft without documentation or technical knowledge of the type, how he navigated back without maps or radio contact, how he avoided being shot down by friendly forces. Carr answered each question with the same calm precision he brought to the cockpit. He described the crash landing, the decision to move toward the airfield, the observation of German procedures, the theft of the Focke-Wulf, and the flight home. His account was factual, stripped of bravado or embellishment. He had done what needed to be done. The Focke-Wulf became an intelligence windfall. American engineers and test pilots swarmed the aircraft, documenting every system, measuring performance, analyzing design features. Captured enemy aircraft were rare and valuable, offering insights into German engineering and tactics that could be translated into operational advantages. The FWU-190 was thoroughly evaluated, its strengths and weaknesses catalogued for use in combat training and tactical development. But the real story was Carr. Within days, word of his exploits spread through the 9th Air Force. Pilots swapped the tale in ready rooms and mess halls, embellishing details, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some doubted it. Some called it the gutsiest move they had ever heard. All of them understood the audacity it required. Command took notice. Carr was not reprimanded for his unorthodox escape. Instead, he was recognized for initiative, resourcefulness, and an almost reckless determination to return to the fight. He was promoted and continued flying combat missions for the remainder of the war. He did not view himself as a hero. In his mind, he had simply solved a problem using the tools available. He was a pilot. There was an aircraft. The logic was straightforward. The execution was all that mattered. Other pilots began to see him differently. He became a symbol of something larger, a reminder that in war, adaptability and nerve could outweigh doctrine and procedure. His story reinforced a truth that every combat aviator understood. Survival often depended on the ability to improvise under impossible conditions. Carr flew dozens more missions. He engaged enemy fighters, strafed ground targets, escorted bombers deep into Germany. He survived the war with a confirmed kill record and a reputation as one of the most unorthodox pilots in the European theater. But it was the stolen Focke-Wulf that defined his legacy. The ripple effects of Carr's exploit extended beyond his personal story. The successful theft and flight of the FW-190 underscored critical lessons about aircraft design, pilot training, and operational security. American engineers studied the Focke-Wulf intensively. They noted its wide-track landing gear, which provided excellent ground handling, a contrast to the narrower gear of some U.S. fighters. They analyzed its radial engine layout, its armament configuration, and its cockpit ergonomics. The data informed ongoing development programs and tactical assessments. For training commands, the incident became a case study in adaptability. Flight instructors emphasized the importance of understanding fundamental principles over rote memorization. Pilots were encouraged to think critically about aircraft systems, to recognize patterns, and to trust their instincts when formal procedures were unavailable. Carr's ability to start and fly an unfamiliar aircraft without technical documentation validated the philosophy that a well-trained pilot could operate almost anything with wings. Operational security also received renewed attention. The ease with which Carr accessed the German airfield and stole an operational fighter exposed vulnerabilities in base security protocols. Both American and German commands reviewed procedures for guarding aircraft, controlling access to flight lines, and verifying personnel identities. The incident served as a stark reminder that in the fluid chaos of war, assumptions about safety and control could be dangerously flawed. Among fighter pilots, the story became legend. It was repeated in briefings, recounted in memoirs, and passed down through generations of aviators. It embodied the fighter pilot ethos: aggression, initiative, and an unshakable belief that the mission could be accomplished regardless of the odds. Carr's actions also highlighted the psychological dimension of air combat. His decision to steal an enemy aircraft, rather than evade on foot, reflected a mindset that refused to accept defeat. He did not see himself as a downed pilot awaiting rescue. He saw himself as a fighter pilot temporarily separated from his aircraft. The solution was not to hide, but to find another plane and get back in the fight. This mentality was not unique to Carr, but his execution of it was extraordinary. It demonstrated that the best pilots were not merely skilled technicians, they were problem solvers, capable of rapid decision-making under extreme stress, willing to take calculated risks when the alternative was surrender or capture. In the months that followed, other pilots attempted similar feats with varying degrees of success. Some stole vehicles and drove toward friendly lines, others commandeered boats, bicycles, or even horses. A few tried to steal aircraft, though none replicated Carr's precise combination of timing, audacity, and luck. The broader pattern was clear. American air crews were resourceful, aggressive, and unwilling to accept captivity without a fight. Bruce Carr survived the war. He returned to the United States, married, and eventually rejoined the Air Force as it became a separate branch in 1947. He flew in Korea, logging combat missions in jets, adapting once again to new aircraft and new battlefields. He retired as a colonel, his career spanning 3 decades and 2 major conflicts. He rarely spoke about the Focke-Wulf. When pressed, he described it matter-of-factly, as if stealing an enemy fighter were a routine problem with a logical solution. To him, it was not an act of heroism. It was simply what the situation required. But to those who heard the story, it became something more. It stood as proof that in the chaos and brutality of war, individual initiative could still alter outcomes, that one man, acting alone, could defy overwhelming odds and succeed through sheer determination and skill. The FW-190 Carr flew home was eventually scrapped, its usefulness exhausted. But the lessons it carried lived on. Fighter tactics evolved, training programs adapted, and every pilot who heard the story understood that in war, the difference between survival and death often came down to a single decision made in a heartbeat. Carr passed away in 1998 at the age of 77. His obituary noted his combat record, his decorations, his decades of service. But among aviators, his legacy was distilled into a single image: a young American pilot, alone and outgunned, climbing into an enemy cockpit and flying home against all reason and expectation. In the end, his story is not about the aircraft he stole. It is about the refusal to accept defeat, about the courage to act when action seems impossible, about the faith that skill and nerve can overcome circumstance. Bruce Carr did not simply escape enemy territory. He turned the tools of his enemy into his salvation. He transformed a moment of vulnerability into a demonstration of mastery. And in doing so, he reminded everyone who followed that a pilot's greatest weapon is not the machine, it is the mind that commands it.